Hello, and welcome to the Mastering Show live Q&A session. This is an experiment. John and I, we're doing this to kind of celebrate, if you like, the fact that my Home Mastering Masterclass course is starting again this Friday. And the idea of this Q&A is it's basically exactly like the Q&As that happen during the Masterclass course. So the course is an 8-week online course where every week I master a different song using different software, different techniques and strategies. I show you what I'm doing and I explain why. And also, anybody who's on the course can email me, ask questions, and 2 or 3 times during the course, we have a hangout just like this, where people can join in and ask me more questions and kind of make sure that they understand everything and get the information that they really want. It's one of the things I enjoy most about running the course. So if sounds like something you might be interested in, head on over to homemastering.com. You can sign up, and as soon as we open the course, you'll be notified about it. So joining me on tonight's live episode, as ever, is John Tidy. Hi, John. How you doing?
Hey, Ian. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
And I think we've got plenty of questions. We should just crack straight on.
Question comes from Sigurdor. How do you think the mastering engineer's job has evolved in the last 10 years and or since you started working as a mastering engineer? Changes in technology, economics?
The thing that springs to mind for me about mastering changing over, so it's 20 years that I've been mastering Sigurdor. I'm slightly appalled. In fact, it's more than 20 years now. And the main thing that I think has changed is that when I started out, nobody knew what mastering was. So the company that I used to work for also offered CD brokering. So people would phone up and they'd say, oh, I want 1,000 CDs pressed. And we would say, sure, no problem. Have you had the album mastered? And people would say, what's that? And that has completely changed over those 20 years. You know, now it seems like everybody thinks they know at least what mastering is and expects it. And that's a complete reversal. In terms of the technology, I think the main move has been into the computer, not just in terms of processing, but when I started out, I was mastering from DAT tapes and from CDs to pneumatic video cartridges that would create the production master that you'd send off to the plant. You know, these days, the whole thing is in computer. I mean, if you'd have told me when I started mastering that one day people would be able to just send a burned CD to the plant that they spent, 20 cents on, I would have thought you were insane. I mean, when we didn't even have recordable CDs for the first few years that I was working, and when the first ones came in, the blanks cost £15 each, which is kind of incredible. And that kind of, in terms of the economics as well, it's just, well, as a guide, if you think I worked for 15 years at SRT, and over that time, I'm not aware that they ever had a price increase. And that was because at every stage, the prices were falling. People were not prepared to pay what they had been prepared to pay. So there was just this feeling that people would rebel if we put the prices up. Having said that, of course, the price of admission dropped as well, because back in the day, you needed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment just to produce a CD master, let alone to do the processing and to make it sound good, and the tape machines and all the other stuff that you need to make to do a good job of mastering. So I think in all of those ways, it's completely changed. So what was part 2 of the question, John?
I'll just jump in and say, when I started, I had Ozone, and I would just use the preset to make it as loud as possible. And now I actually use meters, and I choose my own settings in Ozone.
See, that's music to my ears. And I hope that other people, I know that other people are saying the same things, because I've had other people make the same comments, and that's, I think that's what it's all about. The first thing that I was taught as a mastering engineer was about meters, was about, the difference between peak and RMS level and what I needed to be measuring and what the targets should be. It's actually, that's not strictly true. The first thing I was taught was about digital clock, because when everything was hardware, it was really important to have a continuous line of sync through all of the gear. But yeah, the next thing I was taught was metering. So yeah, that's great to hear.
So Sigurdor's question continues, what changes or trends have you seen and remember come and go, also in mixes maybe, since they do indeed affect how we work?
So the one that jumps to mind there is that, again, back when I started, the main thing that we did, I don't want to say the main thing, but a really important thing that we did for people was make mixes louder. The biggest difference between a mix that someone had recorded and mixed themselves and they submitted for mastering and the stuff that was being done by the major labels and the pros was the dynamics processing, was the compression and the limiting, and just the understanding of balancing levels, balancing EQ, consistent level over the course of an album, all of that stuff. So, we said completely happily to people, oh yeah, I'm going to make this louder for you and it's going to sound better. And now, of course, we've flipped around to the exact opposite, where a huge amount of what I get sent is already too loud and too crushed and too compressed and too processed. And I'm asking people to submit more dynamic material. So it's just a kind of complete inversion of that. Whereas before, people didn't even know that making it loud was something that they needed to do in order to get great results. And now everybody thinks that's the only point of mastering, and all of the other stuff kind of gets lost by the wayside. So that's kind of a bit sadly ironic, I guess.
And final part of this question, where do you see the job going in the next 5 or 10 years? Technology, economics, and et cetera. I think we're already starting to see some changes with the artificial intelligence sort of things and automated mastering.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of got mixed. We've got a specific question about those coming up later, so maybe we won't get too deeply into that now, but that's definitely a change. I mean, the big thing is that, well, people are starting to master their own material. I mean, I say pretty much everywhere on my website, on the home mastering course, that if you want to get the absolute best results from your music, I recommend you go to a pro. But I completely understand and recognize that some people don't want to do that. Some people are not able to do that. And so the idea of people mastering their own stuff is becoming, again, back when I started out, that was just impossible. So I think that's going to become more and more of a trend. I hope, I've kind of watched over the course of my career the studio business gradually decline. More and more of the big name studios in London, in the UK, are closing. I hope that that's reached a point now where the people who are still there can survive, because they have great sounding rooms, they still have great equipment, they have great engineers. There was a point when there were so many studios, it was kind of ridiculous. Now I guess it's a shame there are not enough, perhaps, or not as many as it would be nice to see, because I do think there's something still to be said for a proper recording studio, even though some of the best recordings I've ever heard have come out of people's bedrooms. So that trend is going to continue. I'd be fascinated to see, I've done a fair bit of surround sound over the years, not so much in recent years, but especially maybe 10 years ago when we were doing lots of DVD authoring, we would do surround mixes of concerts and all kinds of stuff. Now we have, you have 7.1, you've got Dolby Atmos with however many, it's kind of almost unlimited number of loudspeakers you can have. And there's the 3D audio thing with binaural sound to kind of create a more realistic sound environment from stereo.
Yeah, and VR headsets and things like that. Be interesting to see if people are releasing music made for that.
Do you say they have already started, or whether people do?
I don't know which way the trend is going to go. I think there will be a few releases designed for that platform, but it'll be audio and video. But I don't think the average person is going to be doing that in their home studio.
No, and I mean, the whole 3D sound with the binaural is an interesting question, because part of the idea of it is you just kind of capture this really pure signal with these microphones in a dummy head. And as soon as you start to mess with that, especially in terms of the phase, it can all fall to pieces. However, the BBC last year, I noticed, were doing experiments where they were broadcasting some of the proms from the Royal Albert Hall. So it's a series of 30 nights of concerts throughout August. The last night of the proms, I guess probably everybody's heard of that. Some of those were being broadcast in binaural, and they were not just using a single dummy head for that. They had some kind of major computer processing technology to be able to do that, to have multi-mics and to be able to blend them together and to add extra effects and stuff. some of those sounded stunning. So I guess that means that in theory you could also master that kind of material. I guess if you use phase linear EQ, you should be able to master it just anyway. But things like compression and limiting, I don't know how those play in. Surround sound still hasn't quite made it so far. And look, I guess it's interesting to me to find out whether in 10 years' time, maybe that will be just standard, where everything will be in 3D. But then it becomes, when you talk about VR headsets and games, we did an episode on games a while back, or sound for games. The role of the mastering engineer is kind of not clear there, because actually the technology is generating the sound on the fly, depending what the person using the system is doing. And the same with VR. How do you master? What do you do with music when people can turn their heads and look around? In fact, I saw Gorillaz streamed a gig recently in 360, the 360 video that you can get on YouTube, which was amazing. You couldn't control which camera they were still switching cameras, but when you were while your view was locked into a particular camera, you could look around. But the music didn't do anything. It was just a static stereo mix. On the one hand, I can understand that. On the other hand, it kind of felt a bit like a shame. So, I think there's potential for all kinds of incredibly creative and interesting stuff in those areas. Whether that will come to anything and we get our hands on it as mastering engineers, I don't know. That's an interesting question.
I'm not sure if musicians are going to want listeners to manipulate the mix and things like that as they listen to it.
No, and that's been possible for a while. Various software. Some musicians are really into that, but lots of them aren't. I'm a bit of a control freak, so the idea of somebody. You've got to get real, right? If people kind of push the button that says surround sound on their amp when they're listening to stereo, they're going to transform the mixes and masters that we listen to anyway. And even if you choose to play it on a Bluetooth speaker that you put up in the corner of your room, that's going to change the way that it sounds. We've got no real control, but even so, I agree, kind of handing it over lock, stock and barrel to the listener kind of feels a bit alien to me. But again, maybe that will change. The way that people interact has completely changed. And if you think about memes, people putting kind of bits of art on the internet and other people taking them and modifying them, all the rest of it, maybe that will happen with music as well. But maybe not. There seems to be this kind of resistance to it in general. Music kind of seems to be sticking to a similar track. It's almost like all of these possibilities are out there, and music kind of ignores it and carries on just being good tunes and great mixes. And I don't know, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe time for another question?
Yeah. So we had some pre-picked, but let's jump into the ones that came in from the live chat. So the first one I've got is from Bob Ellis. Is there a bank of reference tracks available somewhere for mastering and mixing genres that you may not have in your own collection?
Tricky. I don't know about a bank of reference tracks. One thing you can do, there's a couple of playlists. I've got a Spotify playlist of my kind of stuff that has a fair variety of material in it. And there's a Pinterest page as well where I post some of the stuff that isn't on Spotify. So that could be helpful, Bob. There are kind of libraries of music that's out there available to be mixed. I think short of kind of picking an engineer who you like if there's somebody like me who has some kind of show reel out there, that would be one way to do it, or to kind of compile yourself, a playlist somewhere of somebody's work. Say if you're, I don't know, Chris Lord-Alge or Bob Clearmountain or whoever it is, that could work. But no, I don't think there's a kind of a central hub. Do you know anything like that, John?
The only thing I can think of is to check like the iTunes charts and see what's popular in that style, or what are the most popular, 10 albums or whatever in that style. Or there's probably other websites that chart that kind of stuff. And just kind of like build up a mental average of what those things sound like. If you're a professional providing mastering for someone else rather than mixing your own music, then probably have the opportunity to ask them, what do you want this to sound like? What are your references? What are your influences? And, what are 3 albums that influenced the making of this record? What can we do in the mastering to, meet that expectation?
That's a good point. And although, in my personal opinion, if you're going to be a mastering engineer, to some extent, those kind of opinions need to be built in. It's like quite often people send me reference tracks and I listen to it and you take it on board, but take it with a pinch of salt. Because if I literally tried to make stuff sound like some of the references that I get sent, I just wouldn't be happy with the results. Usually I can do what I do and get enough of the flavor of the reference that they've sent in. On the one hand, I've said before, I don't feel like I have a sound. It's not like people send stuff to me and I stamp the Ian Shepherd sound on it. But, there are things that are kind of consistent through all of the masters that I do. And there are definitely kind of places that I won't go or things that I just don't like. It's like, for example, if somebody sends me something that's really kind of narrow in the stereo image, I almost always try and broaden it out a little bit, try and get some space in there somehow, just because that's my personal taste. And if somebody doesn't like that, then probably I'm not the right mastering engineer for them. So reference tracks are great for kind of calibrating your ears. I don't know whether we'll get to it. We had another question from somebody saying that they mix and master with their eyes a lot. It was Ben Axelson, I remember. Saying he mixed and mastered with his eyes a lot, and that's how do I avoid falling into that trap? And my kind of answer to that was going to be that in the early days, I didn't have that problem because the most visual infant feedback I had was I actually had an auxiliary patched from the desk to an old style graphic EQ. It was an 8-band graphic with an 8-band display. So literally I was just, in terms of getting feedback on the EQ balance of the songs I was watching, I was just seeing 8 bands. So that was kind of useful enough to kind of generally help me get the overall balance about right, but useless enough to that I didn't kind of come to rely on it. Whereas nowadays with all these plugins that give you all, real-time FFT and spectrographs and all the rest of it, the temptation to rely on our eyes is much more of a problem, I would say. So I think the main thing I would suggest is, I think all of that stuff is great for training our ears, but don't go to it first. Listen, react based on wherever you're at the time, then check. And if the plugin or whatever it is tells you there's a huge resonance at 100 hertz you hadn't spotted, well, then you can experiment by pulling that back with a bit of EQ and hopefully learn from the experience, and next time you might notice it. The danger is that if you look at the graphics first, you're just responding to them. It's kind of like the difference between using a sat nav and a map in a car. I don't know if anybody else has had this experience. For me personally, if I follow a sat nav, I get to where I want to go, but I have no idea how I got there. And if the sat nav died and I had to find my way back again, I'd be lost. Whereas I don't have a proper sat nav in my car. What I tend to do is look on Google Maps beforehand, get an idea of the route, and then try and follow the mental image in my head to get there. I sometimes get lost and I have to consult and put myself right, but it helps me to have an idea in my head of where I'm going. And exactly the same thing applies to music. So I think if you start off watching the graphics and the analyzers and all the rest of it to figure out, to kind of calibrate your ears and figure out what your monitoring is telling you and what the reference tracks actually sound like, how that kind of connects to what you hear in the real world, but then start just using your ears and checking against the other stuff. And I would say the same thing about reference tracks. Every so often somebody will send me 10 reference tracks for an album. If they send me one, I'll usually listen to it. If you send me 10 reference tracks, I'm probably not going to listen to any of them. I will probably just do my thing, and then I'll listen to the reference tracks and discover whether or not I'm way off the plot. Actually, okay, so there's a refinement to that strategy, that's a bit risky because, especially if you're doing it remotely, you don't want to master an entire album and then find that you were completely out on a limb. So probably what I would do is master one song and then listen to the reference tracks and kind of work from there. But again, you have to take all this stuff with a pinch of salt and somehow try and integrate what the client is asking you for, what everybody else in the world is doing, what your taste says you should do, and come up with your own solution to the problem. That's kind of what it's all about. Sounds quite complicated when I say it that way, but I think it's not that bad in practice. John, do you have anything that you Do you mix with your eyes ever, or are you good at avoiding them?
I trust my monitors pretty well. And it's really just like if I see red on dynameter, things like that, then I'll pay attention to what's going on.
Good.
I mean, it's when you're working with plugins, it's very hard not to look at what you're doing. And, and if you move the EQ past like 3 dB, you start to second guess yourself at times. It looks wrong and you're afraid that you're doing something destructive, but you just have to, not fool yourself, actually pay attention, and lots of A/B testing and things like that.
Yep, absolutely. Cool. We had a question from Norberto. Have you got that one?
I'm finishing a mix/mastering classical project, harpsichord, solo, duet, trio, quartet, and orchestra, all in one CD. Difficult for me not to use compression.
We talked a little bit about mastering classical in one of the other shows, Norberto, so I won't spend too long on it, but it depends what your goal is in terms of whether you want to use compression, because I guess what you're saying is when you have material that is that varied, you need to try and get some kind of consistency in there, and a compressor is the way that we automatically might reach to try and achieve that. But I mean, a lot of classical music is mastered without any dynamics processing at all, or at most a very clean digital limiter just to kind of catch the extreme peaks. So, but it depends on the material. I mean, there's kind of, here in the UK, we have Radio 3, BBC Radio 3, which is pretty purist classical, or classic FM, which is, kind of Il Divo and not the three tenors, but there's Il Divo is a bunch of tenors, I think, kind of pop classical stuff. So they play the really popular tunes, and a lot of the kind of the modern classical stuff that's being produced is Vanessa May, the violinist. I forget whether quite a lot of that stuff is produced almost as though it's pop music. It's really loud and compressed and all the rest of it. So the question is what your clients want fits in that spectrum. If it's towards the classical end, I would try not to use compression. What I would use instead is automation, manual gain rights. So, if you have a quiet section of a piece and then it suddenly comes in really loud, use edits or automation changes to control the dynamics of those two sections, like by turning the loud section down a bit and the quiet section up a bit, rather than compression. Because depending on the instrumentation, I mean, again, harpsichord is an interesting one because it probably doesn't need a heck of a lot of compression because it basically has no expression. You hit the note and it plucks the strings and that's the sound. You don't have the dynamics of, say, a piano. But quartet, string quartet is obviously an incredibly dynamic thing. Again, depending on the type of material, it can be quite hard to use compression in a transparent way on classical material because we just don't expect it. Pop and rock has been compressed since the 50s, certainly the 60s. It's part of the way that we hear the music and the way that we expect it to sound. Same thing doesn't apply to classical. So I understand the temptation, but I would try and not use compression if it's going to be a fairly purist classical project. So hopefully that probably makes your life a lot more difficult. You don't have to take my advice. I mean, so the flip side is if you're using compression, and you've got transparent settings, especially, so you could go for, lower ratios, 1.1, 1.2, I've seen people recommend sometimes. It's not a strategy I use myself, and much lower thresholds so that the compressor is active a lot more of the time, but very gently. So you just gently kind of squeeze the dynamic range rather than that kind of the way that we tend to use it in pop music where you're clamping down pretty hard on the loud sections. That could work, I guess. At the end of the day, if you have a sound that you're happy with and the client is happy with, doesn't matter whether it's compressed or not. If it sounds good, it is good. But beware that people won't necessarily expect that kind of sound. In fact, I did a recording session years ago for a group whose name I'm not going to be able to remember. But the thing was, it was a harpsichord and acoustic instruments kind of playing classical-ish stuff, but stuff that they'd written. And I did what I thought, I loved the recording. Beautiful close mic'd harpsichord sound and I was really pleased with it. They said it sounded very good, but they ended up going off and recording it in a church because they wanted that sound of them playing live in a real acoustic, not the kind of highly produced thing that we gave them. They still paid because at the end of the day, that was their mistake, not mine. If you want a certain sound, you've got to choose whether you go to a church or a studio. But that's the kind of similar question that you've got, Norberto, is whether they want that musicians in a concert hall sound or something else. I think
We have a lot.
There's a ton of comments here. This is great. We're going to have a huge library of questions to draw on. We're just not going to be able to answer all of them this time. I'll look through this.
There are a lot of questions on LUFS and things like that. Do you want to talk about the loudness standards of the different platforms, or?
I actually don't want to talk about it. I want to point people at a blog post that I just did recently. In fact, let me get the exact URL. Let's briefly say, it is true that lots of streaming platforms have different loudness levels that they are normalizing to, right? And people are asking, well, which one should I pick? Which one should I choose? Or do I have to do separate masters for every platform? That's kind of missing the point because they adjust the loudness for you. So what I would suggest instead is master with certain guidelines in mind, and you will end up with a product that will work on all of those platforms. Some of them will turn it down more than others. That's okay. And what the blog post says that I will point you to in a second is that my recommendation is the same as it's always been, which is don't let the short-term loudness go above -9 LUFS at the loudest points in a piece of music. And if you have been listening regularly to the show, you'll probably be able to translate that into the kind of measurements that my Dynameter plugin makes. So I also recommend not letting the true peak go above -1. That means that at the loudest moments, I'm saying that the short-term loudness should be at -9, no higher than -9. If the peaks are at -1, that's a peak to short-term loudness ratio, a PSR, as measured by Dynameter, of 8. So basically, don't let the PSR go below 8. In terms of LUFS, that means don't let the short-term loudness go above -9. Then balance everything else to sound good musically. If it's a full-on rock tune, it will probably be that loud for most of the duration of the song. If it's something much more varied in terms of the arrangement, then it will be quieter at some sections. Probably 3 or 4 dB or loudness units is typical for kind of verse and chorus, if you have a quieter verse and a full-on chorus, say. But yeah, do what sounds right, provided you've listened to the really early episodes of the show where I talked to you about setting a mastering level and getting your metering set up so that you know what you're doing. Now, the interesting thing is that when you do that, when you balance everything by, okay, where are the loudest moments? Here's how loud I'm going to make them, and everything else is going to fit in around that. Then when you measure the integrated loudness, which is what all of the guidelines for these platforms are measured in, which is the loudness over the length of a song or over the length of an album, you will find, more often than not, that you come up with numbers that are in the range of -11, -14, maybe -15 or -16, which is pretty much, -14 is that's where Spotify and Tidal are. Pandora and Apple Music are a couple of dBs lower. YouTube is a dB higher. So you're going to end up with the kind of values you want, but you don't want to aim for them. Because, okay, flip it around the other way. If you have 2 songs on an album, one is a quiet song and one is a loud song, if you master both of them to -14 LUFS, which is what some people are suggesting, that's not going to work musically because the quiet song is going to be as loud as the loud song. It'll work fine in terms of the loudness normalization on the streaming platform, but you could master the quiet one at -14 and the louder one at -12, and the loudness normalization will make that adjustment for you anyway when people listen on, Spotify or wherever. Just because they do that to the music doesn't mean that we have to do that when we master the music. And in fact, you shouldn't do that because you're just going to tie yourself up in knots because it's not going to satisfying musically. And that's why instead I recommend this no higher than -9 at the loudest moments, short-term loudness. But yeah, there's a blog post where I go into that in more detail, which we will put in the show notes on themasteringshow.com.
You had that article recently on the YouTube, the loudness stats, and I couldn't stop for like 3 days looking at every video what the normalization level was, especially when the ads are really loud at the start of it. Sometimes the ads don't get normalized down.
Well, the ads thing is interesting because so for anybody who hasn't seen this blog post yet, we'll put a link to this in the show notes as well. A reader of the blog messaged me a few weeks ago, saying, hey, YouTube are displaying normalization values. So these days, if you right click on a YouTube video and choose stats for nerds, which I love, one of the stats that it shows you is the normalization levels. It will show you the amount in dBs that your song is higher or lower than what YouTube are normalizing to. So YouTube doesn't use LUFS, but even so, their normalization level is about -13 LUFS. So if you master your song at -10 LUFS, they will turn it down by 3 dB. So you'll see a reported value there. It'll say loudness content, something like that, +3. Whereas if you master at -14, it will show loudness content -1. And then it will show you the percentage amount that the replay volume is being changed by YouTube to achieve the normalization. And one of the interesting things when you start looking at that, as John says, is you can say that the ads are being normalized. There's lots of people, whenever I talk about normalization on YouTube, everybody gets annoyed and says, well, the ads aren't being normalized. They are. The problem is that not all of them are being measured. I mean, YouTube's normalization system still seems to be flaky. Just for example, it seems like nothing in August got normalized. Since 2 weeks into September, this new statistic appeared. My guess is that they were tweaking the system somehow, and they kind of put the normalization measurements on hold. And probably retrospectively, all of those songs will get measured and will get normalized. But I think the same thing applies to the ads. And I don't know whether the ads slip through the net, or whether there are just so many of them that don't get measured, or how it works, but it's a lot less consistent. The whole thing is still a little bit messy, but it is happening, and now you can see the exact numbers if you want to. But as John says, it's a real time suck.
Yeah, I feel like, well, not just in music that's on YouTube, like every show, everything you watch and every ad should have that stat there. And if it's at 100%, that means it's not normalized at all. And if it's like 53 or something like that, then it's that means that it's turned down by half. I don't remember. I'd have to look at it to know.
50% is a 6 dB reduction, right? Because it's basically using the dBs translating to power kind of equation.
That means that it was uploaded too loud and it's been turned down by 6.
As far as YouTube are concerned, yeah.
Yeah, and their reference level is -14 LUFS?
It's not exact because they're not using LUFS, but it's -13-ish.
Okay.
I mean, I hope that all of them are going to start using LUFS in future. Tidal uses LUFS. That means it'll be predictable. People will know what to expect when they upload something. Shooting for targets then will make more sense. I mean, the other thing that's happened recently is Spotify reducing their levels. So Spotify used to be roughly -11 LUFS, and they've reduced that by 3 dB. So they're down now at -14 as well. The great thing about that is that most music, pop and rock music, that we work on most of the time, that's plenty of headroom in terms of the difference between the loudness and the peak. Even some kind of absolute classic albums probably master at like kind of -12 LUFS. They've still got plenty of dynamics in there. So I think that's what I'm saying. Don't feel, on the one hand, mastering the entire album at -8 makes no sense, because -8 is too loud and it will get turned down and it will just sound worse than it would have done if you'd given it more space. On the other hand, deliberately trying to master at -14 because that's what YouTube will eventually, or Tidal will eventually make it, that doesn't make any sense either if it doesn't sound right for the material work. I mean, if we're working in pop and rock and kind of quite dynamically controlled genres, I've always said loudness is about finding the sweet spot. And that means not too loud, but also not too quiet. Back in the day when I first started mastering, as I mentioned earlier in this Q&A, we were routinely making things louder, and we were telling people, and it was true, that process will make them sound better. The process of saying, okay, I'm going to move this song from -18 where it was mixed up to -12, say, where I'm going to master it. You have to use a certain amount of dynamic processing to achieve that. And when you do, you will improve the chances of that translating to the widest number of systems. You will have to balance the EQ. You'll have to make all kinds of decisions. So it's not sounding better because it's louder, but a byproduct of the process of making it louder is that you end up making it sound better in order to get it there. And it wouldn't necessarily sound right if you took a really loud song and only went for it at -14. I mean, actually, this is all a matter of taste. And it all depends how much limiting you're using. There's lots of mastering engineers out there who would say that even -14 is too loud. So for me personally, over the years, most of my stuff is kind of in that -12 to -14 range. I'm very comfortable with the way that it sounds. Having said that, over recent years, and especially since using Dynameter and Perception, my plugins, I've found that I've been edging my levels back and becoming more conservative. So maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to look back on this and even the kind of -12 or -14 will feel too loud. That's another interesting question, going back to Sigurdur's point about, the future of mastering, what's going to happen to loudness. And I suspect we're going to move slowly towards more and more dynamic material. But yeah, right now, don't get tied up in these. I guess that's ironic because I've been posting so many blog posts on them and doing so much research into them because people are so interested in them. But use these things as information. Don't use them as recipes for the way that you master your music. You need to know about this stuff, but then you make musical decisions with that knowledge kind of to back you up.
Let's go on to another question. Question from Chris. Do we have an opinion on absolute polarity? So if you flip phase on both channels, do you hear a difference?
So it's been years since I did any listening on this, and I did do some listening a long time ago. And I didn't have ABX testing materials, so I did my classic 3-fingered mouse trick where you randomly click the mouse button. You have to use I have to use 3 fingers. I found that I could subconsciously keep track of how often I had clicked it if I used 2 fingers. 3 fingers was enough to not know what I was clicking. I wasn't looking at the screen, so I couldn't tell what I was listening to. And I think I scored something like 80% of the time I could figure it out. But it's a pretty subtle thing. There are some kind of obscure test tones where absolute phase, absolute polarity, right? When the voltage in the wire goes up, does the speaker push or pull back? Places where you see that in real musical situations are if you look at brass instruments. If you've got a brass instrument with a mic towards the bell, the waveform spends more time in the positive side. It's not equally balanced, positive and negative in the waveform shape. It's kind of above the line more often than it is below the line, which is to do with the harmonic structure of what comes out of the instrument. The question is whether that matters when it gets played out of speakers. And so on the one hand, I would say, yes, I think I was able to hear it when I really put myself under the microscope. On the other hand, I discovered after several years mastering with a piece of hardware that will remain nameless that it was flipping the absolute phase for me, and I had never realized. And a client pointed it out, and we discovered there was a bug in the software. And nobody up to that point had complained. So I think it's one of those last few percent kind of things. And even if you saw a waveform, let's say something started with a solo trumpet and the waveform looked upside down to you, where it was kind of more below the line than above it, I guess I would consider flipping the absolute phase in that case. But the question then would be, is it just that instrument or is it the whole mix where the polarity has been inverted? And I think, I need to clear up, we're not talking about just one channel. If you invert the polarity on one channel, it's going to sound very odd on almost any material. This is a different. You have both channels where the polarity is flipped. So it's just the waveform is going up when it should have been going down, or down when it should have been going up. So I think, yes, it is audible, particularly for some instruments and some particular types of sound. I guess electronic sounds could be another candidate where you might get quite a natural waveforms that might be more audible. But I think mainly we have to rely on people to get it right in the mix, because what's much more common for me is to find something that's wrong. Like you might find that the kick, pushes out, the waveform goes up when the transient hits, and the snare is the other way around because they had a cable wired backwards, or the polarity was flipped and they didn't realize. So that kind of thing happens quite a bit. And of course, there's nothing you can do about that at the mastering stage. So then it's just a question of warning the client and seeing whether they want to fix it in the mix. Have you ever tested this, John? Can you hear it?
I feel like I have tested it with like an 808 kick drum. I'll just polarity invert as it's looping. And I think it's something you can trick yourself into hearing easily, but it might not actually make any difference. On its own, you're not likely to hear a problem, but when it's one thing that's out of phase with something else, polarity inverted with something else that is processing in parallel with it, things like that, then it makes a difference.
Yeah, I think I'd probably go along with that.
Question from William. Curious as to what you think about the AI advances we're seeing in the new 08 and 2 from iZotope and Newfangled Audio's Elevation. I haven't tried these yet. They're interesting, but I'm pretty happy with the tools that I have at the moment as well.
Yeah, I haven't tried them either. I've watched the videos for Neutron, which I think is the N2 in the iZotope 08 N2, and I thought it was a really cool idea. I've seen other people talking about them saying that actually it made them slower rather than faster. And I wonder whether it would be most helpful as a learning tool, because the idea of like Neutron is you give it 2 tracks and it will tell you which EQ ranges might be fighting on those 2 tracks. And you can experiment with cutting one to allow space, cutting the EQ on one to allow space for something else. I think that's a really cool idea. It's the kind of thing that I do instinctively. And part of me wonders whether if there are people who need it, almost like we were saying about mixing with your eyes earlier on, I'd be concerned that you'd end up relying on those plugins and not figuring the skills. So I think anybody using those should very much approach it as okay, I'm going to use this to learn. It's a suggestion for ideas, and then I'm going to try, like if there's another 2 tracks in the mix, rather than just immediately firing up Neutron, I'm going to try and figure out what's going on myself, and then maybe compare it with the suggestion that Neutron makes, that kind of stuff. I think the idea of AI to help people get better results in general is really interesting and really exciting. And I mean, I am very intrigued by all of the automated mastering systems. I've played with a few of them, and so far I haven't found one that I can wholeheartedly recommend, but it's really early days. And I do feel like some of what we do as mastering engineers can be approached in that kind of artificial intelligence way. But at the end of the day, I feel like mastering is all about a human listening to a song. It's, I think all of these things to me remind me of, the auto contrast function in Photoshop, where you just, rather than opening up the levels tool and adjusting all of the things yourself and fine tuning it to get the perfect example, you just press a button and it gives you something that's a heck of a lot better than it was. It may or may not be the best that photo will ever look, but you kind of don't care because you just want it fixed quickly. That's what I feel about all of these automated mastering things. I feel like that's all they ever can be, because it's just a machine making those decisions based on rules rather than a human making those decisions based on emotions. It's kind of like all of the loudness stuff we were talking about. The machine's rule might be, oh, it's a kind of a rocky track, I'm going to make it this loudness. That might be right 8 out of 10 times. But the other 2 times, maybe there's something about, the artist has deliberately chosen a kind of thin and trashy sound, and they don't want it to sound as big as the other one, so they don't want the big bass boost in the EQ or whatever. And those are the kind of things that we have empathy as humans about the artistic decisions people have made in the recording and the mixing, and a machine's never going to have that. So I'm kind of torn on these things, because I'm simultaneous. The scientific bit of me is really interested in how good a solution can you get to these problems, and what clever ways can you come up with to help people get better results. And then, the part of me that just really loves doing the job and making those decisions of going, well, I'm going to make this one a little bit louder just because it feels right to me, or I'm actually not going to make that one quite as loud, or whatever it is. This one I'm going to keep. I hear that it's so. Just today, I was doing a demonstration video for YouTube channel of balancing 3 songs just using EQ and limiting. One of the songs was a house track. One of them was a kind of sort of slightly electronica, dubby, kind of big, soft, warm thing. And one of them was basically kind of punky. And I deliberately chose not to boost the bass as much on, punk is guitars, bass, and drums, and shouty vocals, basically, or it was in this case. So based on that instrumentation, I might have said, okay, well, I want to boost the bass like this to get all this weight in the kick drum and big, rich bottom end in the bass guitar. And I decided not to, because it wasn't right musically. It was intended to be kind of aggressive and thrashy and a bit thin. I guess machines could get to the point where they could do that kind of stuff, but I don't think they're there yet. And I think there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. So yeah, I find all this stuff fascinating and interesting, but I have reservations. And in fact, the video that I was just talking about, where I mastered 3 songs just using EQ and limiting, is going to be on Robert Mays's YouTube channel soon. His website is Musician on a Mission. I think that's .com. We'll put it in the show notes for everybody who's interested. So if you want to see that video, head over there and take a look. And I'm doing that video for him because he asked me to, and I'm a nice fellow, but also to help promote the Home Mastering Masterclass that I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this live Q&A. As I mentioned then, it's opening up again on Friday. If you sign up during the first week before the course officially starts, you get an introductory discount, which is roughly 30%, depending on which option you go for. The Home Mastering Masterclass is probably the most popular thing that I do. I think it's probably the thing that I'm proudest of. It's not as structured as Home Mastering EQ, for example, but it covers a huge amount of range. So every week I master a different song by a different artist. There's an interview with each artist about the mastering process. You basically get a fly on the wall view of me mastering those songs. And it's structured in the extent that, the first song is pretty straightforward. And then as we move through the course, there are more and more tricky examples. And I get into things like stereo image, parallel compression, and sort of the more unusual strategies that I might use in mastering. There's been extra content added. There are some hidden bonus features these days since the first time that I ran the course. Over 1,000 people have taken it. I get great feedback. I mean, we do Q&As like this as part of the course. It's always great to connect with people, find out what their problems, which problems they're having with their mastering. We talk about how to deal with the fact that you probably don't have a mastering studio, how to deal with the fact that you might be mastering in the same space that you're mixing in, how to use reference tracks, something we touched on in this call, how loud your monitoring should be for mastering and why that's really important. We talk about guidelines for loudness, EQ, compression, all of these different topics. Basically, it's me offering as much as I can about how I do what I do to try and help you get better results. Whatever questions you might have, I will do my best to answer them as best that I can. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, please head over to homemastering.com. If the course is open, you can sign up straight away. If not, you can just drop your email into the box and you will be notified as soon as it opens up again. John did the mastering course years ago now, and told me he liked it.
I think it was the first round.
You're an early adopter.
It was the first round of the class. Yeah.
Cool.
That was great.
Good. Oh, I'm glad you liked it. You should probably do it again. There's been some more stuff added since then.
I think I should.
Oh, that's something else that I should have mentioned. There's also, but if you sign up to the course, you get membership of a private Facebook group where there's now over 500 members. It's a fantastic community. Everybody who's there has done the course. There are some great people there, like John, like Ian Stewart, who some of you will know from the podcast, like Sigador, who asked the first question this evening. It's a really supportive, friendly atmosphere there. People kind of share examples of what they've done and get feedback and ask for help with stuff. I'm really proud of the course, I think. And if you want to know more about mastering your own music, or just find out more about mastering in general, it's a great resource. So please do head over and check it out, homemastering.com, if you're interested. That's enough sales pitch, I think. Thanks to everybody who sent questions this evening. I always say on the course, great questions make for a great Q&A, and now we've got about 15 or 20 more for future Q&A. So thank you for that. John, thank you for helping me out with managing the questions and for mixing and editing the show, as always.
Absolutely. This was fun.
Yeah, it was good. I think we should do it again sometime. I have no idea how many people actually tuned in live, but we will edit this up and package it up as a normal podcast episode that will be out sometime in the next week. Thanks, as always, to Kaylee Law for allowing us to use his music for the show. Please, if you like the podcast, if you hadn't kind of come across the podcast before and you're just listening to this for the first time, there's a ton of stuff in the archives. Please head to themasteringshow.com, look at some of the older episodes. The first 7 episodes are a kind of starter course, if you like, taking you through the whole mastering process. Pretty structured set of episodes there. And if you like the show, please head over to iTunes and give us a rating and a review to help other people find it too. Thanks for listening. Broadcast has been successfully terminated.